There is the position of the United States on the one hand, but I am very happy that all other G20 heads of states and government have agreed that the Paris Agreement is irreversible.
German Chancellor Angela Merkel hosted the G20 Summit, acknowledging there were some sharp differences between the U.S. and the other countries. And it's time now for our Sunday group, Fox News senior political analyst Brit Hume, columnist for The Hill, Juan Williams, former Democratic Congresswoman Donna Edwards, and former Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich, author of the best-selling book, Understanding Trump. Well, Speaker Gingrich, G19 was trending on Twitter this weekend because of sharp differences between the president and all the other leaders, especially on climate change, but also, as you heard, my discussion with Reince Priebus on trade. Is that a good thing or a bad thing for the U.S.?
I think it's a good thing. Look, the president starts from a simple premise. We have a whole series of agreements that are bad for America. Well, they're good for the guys that got the deals. So all these guys who got these good deals are going, oh, gosh, you actually want to change the agreement? Well, same thing with NATO. We went out and said to NATO, pay your fair share, including Germany, by the way. And all of a sudden, they're shocked that we want to actually have them help defend themselves. So if you're going to go in and you're serious about changing the trade deals, the other side, who have had a good free ride, are going to be mad at you. If you're serious about changing the Paris Accord on economic grounds, which is what Trump said, if you read his speech, it's very clear that he thinks this is a bad deal for America. Well, if you're the Germans and the Chinese and the Indians, you think it's a great deal for you. So I think he did exactly what he promised to do. I think that's exactly what the campaign was about. If they think they can get along without the U.S. in the Paris Accord, let's talk about it 6 months from now, because the truth is Angela Merkel in Germany ain't that big. And those people don't have that much clout. And in the end, remember, he starts the week by going to Warsaw. So between Theresa May in Britain and the Polish governor of Warsaw, he's also reminding the Europeans. The Europeans are split on a lot of issues. We don't happen to be with the chancellor on them.
Congresswoman Edwards, let me bring you in on this, because while there certainly were differences and the European leaders aren't happy about this, and in many cases kind of said it's 1 against 19, I'm sure there are a lot of Trump voters who would say playing nice with the rest of the world hasn't helped them, particularly in the case of jobs that they've lost.
Well, I don't think it's a question of playing nice. It's a question of being a leader of the world. And I think that one of the perceptions coming out of the G20 is that the United States doesn't seem to be standing in its leadership position. And so, you know, look, I was not a big fan of many of those trade deals. I think that it's really important for us to look at ways that we protect the American worker, that we strengthen our manufacturing force. And so I think it's appropriate to look at those things, but it doesn't mean leaving the rest of the world behind.
It's an interesting formulation here, and you're hearing it from Congresswoman Edwards and from many others as well, which is that if the president is out of step with the leaders in Europe, in other words, if he refuses to follow them, he is therefore not leading. To me, that just, on logic grounds, that doesn't make any sense. He's taken a different path. There are many nations who will be with him. Certainly the reception he got in Warsaw indicated that as well. And because he's out of step with a certain group of European leaders does not mean that he's given up a leadership role. It may indeed mean he's embracing it.
But let me ask you one, and you know, it was a very interesting conversation I had with Reince Priebus on this question of steel imports. He basically says he's going to impose limits on steel, and you get the head of the European Commission saying, good, we'll then impose limits on some of your exports.
Right, so you get into a trade war situation. So you see that inside the White House, you have people like Steve Bannon saying, yes, this will appeal to our base, to people who feel that they've lost jobs because of these trade deals that are unfair to American workers. But you get then people on the National Economic Council, Gary Cohn and others, saying, you know what, we don't want a trade war. We don't need that kind of static right now. The economy seems to be going along pretty well. We had good numbers this week. Why would you want to disrupt that? And I think for a lot of people, this question then extends to the leadership issue you're hearing discussed here this morning. So my take on this is, when you talk about American leadership, you have to understand we have the biggest economy in the world. We have the biggest military in the world. We can set an example for other countries. It may be that at some point you say, hey, we're taking more aggressive steps than are being imposed on other countries, so that's not fair to us, but guess what? We're the big boy.
I want to turn to perhaps the highlight of the whole summit, and that was the meeting, at least from the U.S. point of view, the meeting between President Trump and President Putin. Here's the tone they set at the beginning of the meeting.
We look forward to a lot of very positive things happening for Russia, for the United States, and for everybody concerned. And it's an honor to be with you.
I'm delighted to be able to meet you personally, Mr. President, and I hope, as you have said, our meeting will yield positive results.
Speaker Gingrich, how much should we make of what the two men said about Russian meddling? Now you've got President Trump in a tweet this morning saying, I'm going to move forward, Syria, North Korea, all the issues. How are we overstating the importance of this meeting?
Well, I think we'll know in 6 or 8 weeks. I mean, if they actually have a ceasefire that actually works, which also, by the way, involves Israel and Jordan, that's the first time in the Syrian civil war that you will have actually had a joint American-Russian agreement that survived. But I would say that you'll know more about that in 6 to 8 weeks. If they create a relationship where they can get a genuine ceasefire in eastern Ukraine, that is an enormous step in the right direction. If they can create a relationship where the Russians understand that we would defend the 3 Baltic states and that they cannot threaten them, that's an enormous, I mean...
Yeah, there are a lot of ifs there.
And that's exactly right. I don't, given Putin's track record, I can't sit here today and tell you this is a breakthrough. I can tell you that the tone is probably right. The fact that it lasted over 2 hours is probably right. And that Putin is a very tough guy, but I think he may have been surprised by Tillerson and Trump because they're very tough guys. And so I think, to go back to something Brett said, if you end up with 2 sets of tough guys, and one of them has the largest economy, the largest military, the greatest reach in the world, probably that guy ends up winning if he's determined. And I think ultimately Putin is probably going to deal with Trump.
Congresswoman Edwards, you know, I want to ask you about this controversy, and a lot of Democrats have been hitting Trump, a lot of your former colleagues in Congress, at the idea of talking about moving forward. I mean, to some degree, do we want to hold the entire relationship hostage? Just assume the worst, that the Russians meddled like crazy, tried to do everything they could to interfere in the election. Don't we still have to do business with them?
Well, I mean, there's moving forward, and then there is, do we do sanctions relief? And I want to hear what moving forward means, because the fact is the Trump administration actually has been engaged in the Congress trying to loosen the sanctions and are not happy with the bill that came out of the Senate. And so I want to know what moving forward means. Does that mean that we do have to have a relationship at some level to try to deal with Syria? Yes, but our interests in Syria are very different from the Trump administration interest in Syria. We're not going to prop up the Assad regime. I think Russia has that interest.
Chris,
and so,
might I suggest that if the president had a very tense meeting centered entirely on the alleged meddling in the election, which appears clearly to have happened, and the meeting broke up in disagreement with other issues on the back burner, that the president's critics would not have liked that better than what happened. This amounts at least to a renewal of diplomacy in an area where the diplomacy has been in a chill for some time. We'll see what comes of it. It's way too early to judge it, as the speaker suggests. But I can't help but think that it's probably worth a try, at least, to see if diplomatically some things, constructive things, can be accomplished.
All right, we have to take a break here. We'll see you all a little later.